Good morning. We're going to talk about the Brahmaviharas this morning. This is one of my all-time favorite topics. And it's also where in the Yoga Sutras you get pieces of Buddhism introduced. It was at the time in the swinging pendulum of the culture of India that yoga had existed and the Buddha came along to sort of set the middle path. In this same way, he was also a catalyst for social justice, that teachings could be available to people who live in urban lives, not just revered upper status lives, but regular people could now practice meditation and yoga. So he had a kind of balancing effect on the whole system. And he introduces us to the Brahmaviharas in the Yoga Sutras here, so we'll sit for a few minutes of quiet together. And so while we sit, having heard the mention of the Buddha, you might assume a kind of posture you have seen images of, understanding that part of the reason the Buddha sat that way was because it was effective for quieting his mind and being present. And as we sit this morning, if you find that your mind doesn't rest in quiet easily, since the last time you were in this room was just last night and we practiced the meditation for the senses together, you can draw on that as a resource. So invite your ears to listen and to simply listen, without judgment and without narrative. And as you listen, relax your eyes, your nose, your tongue, the skin of your body. So listening is your primary sense right now. And we're listening without listening for danger. We're listening simply to hear the sounds and the silence in which they exist. To listen even to subtle sound and the silence in which sound occurs is to resist the urge to tend to your thoughts. I often say to lift the needle off the record player of mental habit. And now, with appreciation for the experience of listening, bring your attention to your eyes. And though they may be closed or looking down, and the experience of the eyes is very simple, be mindful of the experience of your eyes. Not scanning internally nor externally for danger or threat, simply resting on the neutral experience of this moment. Invite your mental habit, thinking mind, to take refuge specifically in the restfulness of your eyes. At this moment, not looking for the pleasant, not avoiding the unpleasant. Nothing more and nothing less than this simple experience of the eyes. And when your mind wanders, as it has a habit of doing, kindly bring it back to just noticing what's neutral and occurring in the present moment for your eyes. And then bring your attention to the experience of your nose, of the third sense of smell. And again, we're not scanning for a particularly pleasant scent. We're not avoiding an unpleasant fragrance. Nothing more and nothing less than that simple experience of smell in the here and now. And now bring your attention to taste. And again, not looking for the pleasant, not avoiding the unpleasant. Nothing more and nothing less than the simple experience of the tongue in these moments. We're neither aiming to do nor to undo anything, just to rest. The senses not scanning for danger, not grasping for pleasure. And with appreciation for the subtle experience of the tongue and the nose, the neutral inward experience of the eyes, the more outward experience of listening. Now direct your attention to experiencing for the next few moments the skin of your body, the organ of touch. You may notice the air temperature, the texture of your clothing, your connection with the ground beneath you. If your mind tends to be ungrounded, choose one place to be connected to. Though if you find you're relatively present, try to encompass the entirety of the skin of your body. Now, while staying in touch with the skin of your body, if your eyes are already cast down and quietly open, keep them as such. If rather your eyes are closed, I'm going to ask you to open them and gaze down. And without distraction for eyes, nose, ears, or tongue, try to stay connected still to the skin of your body. Without needing to lift your gaze, you can now become aware of the other humans in the room. The Brahmaviharas are interpersonal practices, so with appreciation for each other's presence here this morning, let's join your hands together in Anjali Mudra. And to acknowledge our coming together, we're going to chant the sound of Om 3 times. When our voices mix together, you are now, in a listening sense, made aware of the other people in the room. Let's take a deep breath in. With your exhale, you may bow your head to your heart. Release your hands and open your eyes. So how is your experience of the meditation with your senses? Verbalizing it would be helpful to me. Yes?
I noticed that when I was focusing on the sensations of the tongue and not really like any specific taste or any craving for anything specific, I was still kind of, my body, like my mouth watered. My mouth was watering, even though I wasn't thinking of anything specifically.
Yeah. You get a hint of what it's like to anticipate.
Taste, yeah.
Yeah. So the senses I said last night, they're originally programmed to help keep you alive, to have you survive. But they're also programmed to help tempt you towards pleasure. And pleasure is a part of what keeps us alive. If the human system were devoid of pleasure, it wouldn't thrive. It wouldn't keep going. Even from infancy and earliest life, you can see a shutdown at the level of the brain. If there's not the capacity to experience pleasure, the system goes to those hindrances that include dullness and apathy, resignation. That being said, the five senses are organized to create craving once you've been using them for the pursuit of craving and the sort of temporary satisfaction of desire. One of the paradoxes in the human brain is that you have a hormone called dopamine that's like for motivation of satiation of desire, but it doesn't actually respond to satiation, it responds to motivation or urge. So it's that anticipation neurotransmitter. You're like, oh, I'm going to have a brownie. But eating the brownie doesn't calm the dopamine response. It's the anticipation of the next bite of the brownie or the next tray of brownies. And it can escalate like that. So it's particularly with certain drugs that people get addicted to. Yeah.
I had an interesting experience where I don't usually think of sitting meditation as a chance to listen to my body, because I tend to think of my movement practice as more where I'm listening to my body, but perhaps it was because of the specific sensory awareness that I found myself becoming really aware of my body's experience that had been unnoticed by me for the last few months.
Yeah.
Because my mind has been like, and so
yeah.
like, oh, you've got a lot to tell me, body.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I referenced last night is how sometimes people don't want to come into the present, in the body, in the here and now, because they're afraid of what they might have to feel or encounter. Particularly if we've been sort of away from home for a time. If we've been more in the mind or in the outside life than we are in the inner life or in the body. And sometimes it's easier to start with just the base neutral sensations as they're occurring, rather than starting with the mental narrative or the emotional story that's also accompanying that. I think we are pretty programmed once we are aware that we have a narrative or a feeling or an emotion that we want to solve it, fix it, make it better, improve on it if we can, like make it last longer if it's a pleasant narrative or a pleasant emotion, but somehow diminish and or make it go away or end it altogether if it's not a pleasant narrative or if it's an unpleasant emotion. So knowing that you're coming back, I said it last night, like sometimes you'll have that sweet pain of homecoming. It's like you and your body getting reunited. That kind of pain is like when somebody actually is coming home and you feel really joyful but you're also crying. It's that mixture of joy and poignancy for how you've missed somebody and now you're reunited. So you get that complex of feelings that's not just one or the other, it's mixed together. Yeah. Thank you. And welcome back to your body. What else did you notice?
I noticed towards the end when you had us open our eyes, cast our gaze down, that where I felt so, I guess, in tune inside, that all of a sudden it felt like it kind of went away. And I was really having a hard time kind of feeling my skin again. It felt very distant to me.
Yes. Now I'm remembering, tell me if you're having a memory of this. Last module, did you say something similar? Or was it Angie who was talking about something about trying to stay regulated with yourself, but when it comes to then including others, it's hard to navigate both? Was that you, Jennifer? Was it you, Angie?
I feel that. I might have said that, but yeah.
Like we had maybe a pranayama experience, and then one of you in this neighborhood here was talking about how you had felt really clear, but then when we asked it to become larger.
It was the space.
Yeah, I get
The space
the
all
space
around.
yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it was Angie's
Meditation
experience
space.
of that, right?
Yeah,
Because you were
right.
also saying a more internal meditative process is more grounding for you. And then when I asked you guys to feel the orientation,
Yeah.
you got dysregulated. So here you're saying you were connected, but when I invited it to be more interpersonal, you had a hard time staying in touch with the sensation of your own skin. Yeah. The reason I'm asking is because you have this is actually very similar experience, but also it reflects back to us our ability to self-regulate in the company of others. And some people are much more other-regulated. They're not very self-regulated. They're other-attuned and other-sensitive and other-vigilant at the expense of what can happen in here, though it's designed as a protective mechanism and a strategy. It starts to be an expense at a certain time to the intrapersonal life. And then those of us who've really developed the ability to be grounded by going deeply inside, will be are challenged by the interpersonal. We'll have to have some learning curves with that. But certainly to learn how to self-regulate in the company of others is one of our imperatives as a brain and body and heart. Thank you. Anything else that wants to be shared right now? Well, we are at the point in the Yoga Sutras where Patanjali has said, look, you might be having the symptoms, again called hindrances, and if one-pointed attention isn't working very well for you, and if lengthening the exhale hasn't yet worked, and if concentrating on one sense object, we just did the 5 senses as a group so you could feel, maybe one is more effective for you than the other, but he says if concentrating on one sense object isn't working, here's a couple other ideas. And Yoga Sutra 1.33 recommends the Brahmaviharas. My hunch is Patanjali knows that at this point, the reason those other things aren't working is because our interpersonal life may have some chaos to it. In the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras, we'll be recommended to practice the yamas and niyamas, but he hasn't made that suggestion yet. So here, he's going to recommend the 4 Brahmaviharas. They're called the divine abodes of the heart. Brahma means divine, and Vihara is the abode. So it's like the divine homes or the divine refuges for your heart. They're the finest expressions of your heart capacity. They have to be cultivated, but they're also considered innate. In other words, you have to remember them, and then you want to expand on that rather than expanding on the negativity bias, which is also in the brain, as you've heard already. I find it kind of amusing and endearing that now here we are in the interpersonal strife, and Patanjali and our ancestor yogis got that, even though most of them were practicing in isolation. They were ascetics. They still had to rely on parts of their community, like for food to be delivered and so on. So I'm going to ask a general question, and you're welcome to say what's appropriate for you or what you feel compelled to say. How many of you, when you sit down to meditate, you hear a narrative about an interpersonal conflict? He said, she said, I should have said. So thanks for raising your hand. And does this happen with some frequency? What you're going to say to somebody, what you wish you had said to somebody, what 2 people said to each other and the way that affected you. Does that come up during meditation? Yeah. Yeah. We're interpersonal creatures. We live with social brains and in networks. So in the Brahmaviharas, in the Yoga Sutras, you just hear what the 4 Brahmaviharas are called. But in Buddhism, you also hear the near enemy and the far enemy. And I'll give you the whole sketch. Whether I'm going to write on the board or not, I don't yet know. But maybe I'll put the Sanskrit spelling so you can see that. So the first of the Brahmaviharas is called Karuna. Karuna means compassion. So Karuna, as the first, I think if you read Buddhism in another translation, before compassion is a Brahmavihara called patience. It didn't get mentioned in the sutras. I don't know how it got left off. It's like there's 5 yamas and 5 niyamas in the Yoga Sutras, but in my teacher's teaching, which go back in the same generation as Patanjali, he teaches 10 yamas and 12 niyamas. So I don't know where those 5 and 7 got dropped. But before compassion, you might need to have patience with yourself or others. So that's like the the preceder, or what do you call that? The prefix. And then compassion actually translated literally means your capacity to suffer with others. Passion means to suffer, and compassion means to suffer with others, like community, communication, communion, compassion. Commiseration. I'm not recommending that one, but do you understand that's the root of the word here, common passion? So for our capacity in compassion to develop, we have to be willing to feel our own uneasiness. We have to be willing to feel the ways in which we go out of balance, and to be patient with those things as well as patient towards the way in which our fellow humans go out of balance. I think it's Rilke who says in one of his passages that he's talking to a young poet. This is in Letters to a Young Poet. And the poet has asked him a question, and he responds to the poet in the letter by saying, do not seek the answers now for the questions that you're asking, because you can't live those answers yet. Try to be patient with all that is unresolved in your heart, because you will actually live along into the answers. So he says, I beg you, before all beginning, to be patient with all that is unresolved in your heart. You are so young. You are so much a beginner. And he goes on to implore this poet not to try too hard to have the answers that he can't live yet, but to actually go on in the living, moment to moment, into the answers. So when we say, well, how am I going to be compassionate? We might start with patience for ourselves in the earnestness of our efforts to do it. And if we make a bauble, to be patient and forgiving about that too. I'm going to quote one more person because I was just doing some quotes for that graphic design project. And Christopher Titmuss, do you know who this is? Anybody heard of Christopher Titmuss? So I'm from the East Coast, and my first Vipassana retreat was in Barre, Massachusetts, at the Insight Meditation Society in 1989. This is so long ago. And I went for 10 days. I did not know who was teaching. I had never been silent for even a full day. I didn't know what to expect of a retreat. I didn't know what kind of food they served, and I wasn't exactly at ease with food at that time in my life. But I went because the life I was living was stressful and chaotic enough, and a friend showed me a picture of the brochure, and it had trees on it. And I said, oh, I'm going there. I was living in the city of Boston, and I went to the retreat center, and Christopher Titmuss was our teacher. He's from the UK, and he's the founder of a political party on the Greenpeace movement, but also a Vipassana teacher, and is extraordinary and has a lovely English accent. So it's very nice to listen to the teachings of the Dharma with that accent. And he said, what love requires is the willingness to know and understand intimately the conditions for the arising of suffering, and the willingness to resolve a problematic existence. What love requires is to know and understand intimately the conditions that lead to the arising of suffering, and the willingness to resolve a problematic existence. So he's actually pointing to the Brahmaviharas, the willingness to do something about it, not just to see how suffering arises, our own or others, but to then have the willingness to do something. And the Brahmaviharas, it's a funny thing to think about how we do them, quote unquote do, because they're internal practices to benefit our hearts, to be more free in relationship with others. None of them are practices condoning somebody else's behavior. So when we practice compassion for someone, let's say for someone who causes harm to others or to us, we practice compassion towards them. We aren't condoning their behavior. We're trying to free our hearts from the possibility of cruelty or hatred for that person. We're trying to free our hearts from the potential for pity of that person. So always understand when we're speaking about the Brahmaviharas, I'm not saying that other people's behavior is right or wrong or justified or valid or helpful or unhelpful. It's just that there's their behavior and it's acting as a catalyst for you to practice the Brahmaviharas. Much like when you're driving in traffic in Oregon and people are just going so slowly and they don't know how to merge on the freeway. And you're from New York. You think, what is the matter with people? And you can think instead, oh, they're giving me a chance to drive more slowly or to have awareness of my fellow humans on the freeway. I experienced merging on the East Coast as pretty seamless. When I'm driving to Brighton Bush and the person in front of me is going really slow on Highway 22, I think, thank you for slowing me down. But when I lived at Brighton Bush and I was urgent to get home, I was like, what the fuck? We don't have to go 10 miles below the speed limit just to look at the scenery. Because I was in my early 20s and still much more a New Yorker than an Oregonian. And I wanted to get home to Brighton Bush, and they were in my way. It was actually during that time that I learned to say thank you to those drivers. I've kept that as a practice since then. So the other person's behavior is actually to help us practice and to keep practicing. So if your life is very contented and you've had a certain amount of elevation in your practices and you're feeling really evolved and enlightened, I recommend that you either find a service project with a population that you have aversion towards, or go visit your nuclear family for an extended period of time. Then you'll have some things to practice on. People do say in the yoga and Buddhist community, if you want to see if you still have stuff to work on, go back home. So compassion is our capacity to suffer with the heart of another when it's also experiencing suffering. It's like a vibration that happens to you. It's similar to empathy. And it's very interpersonal in that you actually have receptors in your brain and an empathy circuit that needs the experience of the other to awaken the empathy, but can also be broken by the experience of another in early life. People who don't develop empathy circuits didn't have it available to them. So they might have had early care providers that were misattuned or didn't know empathy themselves or couldn't resonate or mirror or reflect. So that child's brain didn't get to pick up on those receptors, didn't get to activate them. In most cases, we can still do some work on that, but in some cases, the brain goes into a certain direction it's not likely to learn empathy. That's an extreme case, which we can save for another conversation. So the near enemy of compassion, like this, which we call like the disguise of compassion, the near enemies are like little costumes covering over the actual thing. It looks like compassion on the outside to some of us, but it isn't actually on the inside. The near enemy is pity or sympathy, both of which in my translation here imply a kind of hierarchy, like I'm going to be compassionate towards you because I'm just slightly above you or greatly above you, and I can sort of bestow upon you my empathy, my compassion, which is really my sympathy and my pity at that point. Because compassion is inevitably and ultimately a self-to-self experience. We are experiencing the same level of heart to heart, not one heart higher than the other heart. Have you guys dabbled with sympathy or pity for your fellow humans? Mm-hmm. A common thing that comes up in these discussions is when people are crossing one of the bridges here in Portland and there's somebody begging at the stop sign. Or you get those intersections where people are holding up the sign and you have an instinct for gaze aversion. Does that happen? What do you think the gaze aversion is about?
Tapping into something that's not containable.
It's uncomfortable and not containable. You said, yeah. Uh-huh. What else happens for you guys with, you want to avert your gaze? Why?
I think it's because my car is like my private space and I want to maintain my privacy sometimes in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah, you might need your personal solitude there and someone is standing with the possibility of intruding on that. Why else might you do gaze aversion?
It's just confusing when they're there because you don't know if they really need help or if they don't need help.
Yeah.
So it's kind of...
We get confused. Yeah, do I take action? Do I not take action? Are they sincerely in need of help? Are they not in need of help? Do I have anything to give right now? I'm not carrying small change very often or even paper money. I'm getting airline miles. So I'm using a credit card for almost every transaction. I don't have something in the car to give in terms of monetary. How do you think it might be to consciously roll down your window and make eye contact?
Well, then they'll come to your window.
Well, if you roll it down when you get to the stop sign, they probably will, but if it's already down, It's not necessarily that you're rolling it down for them. I'm recommending this for you. Roll down the window, and what do you think might happen if you acknowledged? What kind of gaze connection would you provide?
I've done that, and I've done a smile, and they always smile back.
Mhm.
Not always, but for the most part, or they say hello.
Mhm.
So that makes me feel good because I don't always have anything to give, but at least I can be a human and have contact.
And you acknowledged.
Recognize them,
Yeah.
because that's all I have at that moment.
Mhm. Yeah, you offered to them the chance to be seen and acknowledged.
And to acknowledge another human being is really a gift.
Yeah. You can imagine how many people drive by without acknowledging. And if you were standing there, how that might feel if, based on you having a human brain and a human system that is seeking being seen, connected, and understood, and how many cars go by that don't. Somebody who's making contact would feel like a gift. Yeah. Yes.
For me, it's really weird because I've done that, and that's what I want to do. And each time I'm faced with another part of me that like really doesn't, that's like afraid it's going to be awkward, and that just wants to like avert my eyes. But while there's the other part that's like, I sort of looked at them and smiled and like I'm hoping for you. And
Yeah.
that's this inner conflict that I'm faced with every time I pull up to a corner. It's really uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you going to say something right there? See how I know? Sometimes there's
I did have a couple of things running through my noggin, yes. I find that for me, I pull up and I have that same discomfort in part because I'm feeling stingy. I don't want to give to another person who's asking something more of me. Everybody's wanting something from me. The last intersection, I had another one. The last intersection, there's an advertisement on the radio. I won't even listen to the advertisements on the radio because it's somebody wanting something from me again. So it's this overriding sense of something is always being drawn from me. Somebody's always wanting something. So there's a kind of an umbrella resistance to give. But it's not just the giving. I don't even feel the sense of stinginess in the sense I don't want to give. It's just that there's always somebody wanting to take. So I carry this overriding resistance. And then there's the individual ones that come down to each moment to moment. Like, I don't have anything. I have to keep my briefcase in my back of my car. It's like, oh, it's too much trouble. And I have to slow down the traffic. And there's 15 little things that will run through my brain. And before I even pull to a stop, I see them there, and it's already cranking. Yeah, I got 5 or 6 of them going before I even come to a stop. And I hope that there's a car in front of me, so I don't have to have them right next to me. And pretend like I don't see him. And there's so many things that go through there. And thankfully, many of them have short lights. But one of the things that has arisen for me is that, and it's not particularly PC, but that compassion is not compulsion. That I don't need to be okay in this world. I don't need to necessarily give something of myself to every single person who has a need. Maybe it's a rationalization, I don't know, but what I try to do is what you talked about, that just give an acknowledgement. It's not much usually, but it's a friendly glance at least, that I recognize there's a person there. But rarely do I actually give anything. And I'll have a dozen things that run through my head too about, well, if you give them the money, they're just going to spend it on booze, or they're going to have drugs, or they've got all those things in there too, even though I'm not a conservative. Those things run through my head. And I have a residual, oftentimes after I've driven by, but my brain will quickly jump into whatever else I was doing. Within probably a quarter mile or 1/8 of a mile, I'm already freeing myself of the burden of the guilt that arises simultaneous with all this other couple dozen things.
Mhm.
And I don't have a solution to it.
Mhm.
The times when I was, as soon as you said that earlier, I thought, yeah, there was one time I actually did start interacting and didn't have anything at hand to give, and the guy started swearing at me.
Mhm.
So I still carry a little residual about, like,
Mhm.
I don't want to put myself in the position of having to face that again, too.
Mhm.
So I don't have any answers, but lots of little things run through there each time that happens.
Mhm. Yeah. I think, go ahead, Marlene.
Well, and every day is different for me, too. So, I mean, I may give friendly glances one time, or I may have a banana one time, or I
Mhm.
just have no tolerance another time.
Mhm.
So, every day is different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so let's say, since we're on the path of yoga, and one of the recommendations in the sutras is single-pointed attention towards the goal of yoga through single-pointed attention in meditation, for example, or the Brahmaviharas. So if we're on the path of yoga and we wake up in the morning and that's our commitment, but we also know that we're navigating some of those hindrances. So on some days, we don't have the desire or the capacity, we don't have the bandwidth to give because we're experiencing our own ripples. The way we might have been careless, or we overindulged, or we didn't respect our practice, we did something different instead. Then your nervous system has less resilience, less generosity. And there's an expense to us to realize when we're in that state. So that's where you cultivate compassion for yourself. Like, oh, I didn't have it in me today to make eye contact with the guy at the corner, or the children with the mother at the corner. So if you acknowledge that with compassion towards yourself, it doesn't then have to also include separating yourself from that person or persons on the corner. There's a sense of the vulnerability you're experiencing and the vulnerability they're experiencing are different kinds of vulnerability, but there's mutual vulnerability. And compassion is often the recognition that we're mutually vulnerable in the species on the planet.
Yeah, there's something in there's something bigger that you're sharing than this transaction,
Yeah.
this need or that need, or this particular day, or there's a shared humanity that's
Yeah.
way bigger than the discomfort we have in that moment or what they're asking of us.
What happens next in the Brahmaviharas also is you do actually get an action step that you can use. Let me just note that the far enemy of compassion is actually cruelty. So if you find yourself feeling or experiencing the urge for cruelty towards someone who makes you uncomfortable, like the person we mentioned, maybe you wish they would go away, and you wish it bigger than just a casual glance. You actually feel like imposed upon and ruffled by and cruel about it. That would be cause for really double-checking yourself, like how respectful have I been towards my own brain, body, and heart? What is in my shadow? What's in my history? What just got triggered for me? I saw that person. My senses took that person in. What about their physique or their presence or their facial affect triggered me? That's where you start asking the questions. You really should ask before you get to the far enemy, but just in case you get there, to the far enemy of cruelty, there are also tools to use, inquiry tools and self-compassion tools. And self-compassion isn't letting yourself off the hook. It's not actually the same as being gentle with yourself. When we translate the phrase being gentle with ourselves, people are often being more passive or more like a little bit lazy about sticking clearly with what their heart intention is. So let's say that you've tried compassion and it didn't work. It wasn't the remedy. The next of the Brahmaviharas is called loving kindness or Maitri. So you see someone suffering, and if you have the capacity for that mutual glance and to feel larger vulnerability of both humans, that's lovely. But if you see them and you mostly have aversion, like Jay was describing, some of the guilt and the mental ruminations, or like, I want to keep my window up because I don't want to connect, or I hope it's a green light when I go by, and so on. If that's what's happening, you can actively say to yourself about that person, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you and all beings vulnerable at this moment be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you experience ease and harmony. May you find some happiness and connection. So you make an active prayer for that person to alleviate suffering for them. Now, again, you probably don't have that much agency for them on behalf of their lives, but there you are. With that quality of prayer, you're less likely to condone unskillful behavior and less likely to feel like your cruelty is merited. You say, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering.
And you haven't gone into dissociation there either, which is an easy fallback position.
Yeah.
Make that not happen.
Mm-hmm.
We were just talking this weekend with Alicia when she was.
Yeah.
We were talking about
India.
going to India and particularly Varanasi. And she does not want to go because she thinks that she wouldn't be able to handle all of the poverty and the suffering that is everywhere. Whereas her husband was enthused about it.
Bessel loves Varanasi. We were sharing stories about where we went and where the ghats are, and they're carrying the bodies through the village on the hands of the dead bodies, all decorated, going for the funeral pyre, and the three of us are lighting up, and Alicia's leaning back. And definitely distinctly different relationships for them to Varanasi.
Yeah, she was afraid she didn't do it. I think that she has so much compassion, but she doesn't have seemingly another way to deal with it. She feels compelled. Her body, her mind is compelled to do something about it, and that would be overwhelming to her. It probably would, but I think that there's something else. I know that when she was talking about here just now, Sarah Joy, that you're connecting with them on a bigger scale that doesn't have to do, again, with this individual person, their individual experience, or your individual experience, that we're all here, and I wish you well.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, I can't handle this, I got to get away from it.
Yeah.
It does take a little bit of effort you need to give yourself a couple of days to adjust to the bombardment, because there is some filtering that has to happen, because nothing is like it.
There's no other thing like India or Varanasi. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. So let's look at it in terms of loving kindness. The near enemy is attachment, also called grasping in this case. So let's say that you have the instinct to practice loving kindness towards someone who's caused you harm. I'm going to make it more personal right now. So you hear about this meditation practice, loving kindness. You hear, we just pray for that person's freedom from suffering and pain and happiness and so on. So bring to mind for a moment somebody who's caused you harm or made a dent in your life in a way that was painful. And you hear me saying, you could say about that person and towards that person, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you know peace and joy. May you know love and harmony. Do you have any resistance to doing that when I suggest it? Yeah. Yeah, that's often the first thing that comes up is we have resistance to doing it because that person caused us pain, or they caused harm, or they made a dent in our lives and our well-being and our reputation or our trust or confidence, or they betrayed us, or they held us back, or they were dishonest, and the list goes on. So again, the reminder that the practices are to free up our own hearts. So when we say to that person, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering, may you experience peace and joy, if we're saying it but we're still holding on to that clench in the heart, we're still holding on to our little flinch about it or our big flinch about them, we're probably reciting the prayer hoping for them to change. If I say this prayer enough, this person is going to realize the pain that they cause, and they're going to be so transformed by my praying for them. They'll be transformed into the person that I think they need to be. That's called attachment. That's the near enemy of loving kindness. I'm willing to do this prayer, but only if it's actually going to cause them to change their behavior. It's also called grasping, because I want a certain outcome.
And related to pity.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you get to arouse pity again. And hierarchy. Because now you're better than they are, you're doing the prayer and they're not.
ex-husbands with that written all over it.
How many of those do you have?
Just 2.
Oh. Yeah. So to practice loving kindness, to really know that the internal motivation is to free your heart, that's a significant difference in how and why you're practicing. So if I'm going to say first then, towards the pain that I've been experiencing, I might say, may I be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May I be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. Thank you, Jay. That's poquito, suffering. That's the sound you hear. I don't know if you guys heard it from the office, but we hear it because it's our dog. We know that little sound. Yeah, he's probably got stuck in there by himself. So we say the prayer, may I also experience peace and joy. May I know love and harmony. And you can practice saying it towards someone who's been really kind towards you, someone who we call a benefactor. They've benefited your life. They've been benevolent, and they were a resource at a time when you needed it. And you say towards them, whether it's now or historically, you say, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you know peace and joy. And may you experience love and harmony. And you choose a neutral person. We'll do this at the end of class, you get to experience it. So you say to your postman. Neutral because, you might know the postman, but you're not really intimate with, unless you are intimate with your postman. Some people say, I must be the postman's child, but they're teasing. So you say towards a neutral person, may you also be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. The person driving too slowly in traffic in front of you, may you know peace and joy. You start to make these wishes for other people's well-being, and then you can bring in the person with whom you're struggling. So you're doing these little warm-up practices, starting with yourself, and then being able to go towards the other persons that are easier for you to consider practicing it with. So that by the time you get to working with the person with whom you're in conflict or you felt some pain, you actually feel your heart's been changed enough to welcome that person into the prayer also. I've used this several times on people who were painful for me in my life. It was very liberating for me. It really helped to resolve the residue that I was still holding on to about how they'd been an unskillful person or a painful person. Hi, honey. So your empathy circuits are lighting up when you watch Poquito walk to his bed, right? Also, your adorable circuits are lighting up. I know. So loving kindness, the far enemy of loving kindness is ill will. So towards those people who have caused you harm, have you had a feeling of ill will? You hope something bad happens to them and they learn their lesson? Or you hope the kind of pain they're causing you happens to them? You guys have had these thoughts, right? You have Western conditioning and you have mental habits. Yeah. Did that feel like good biochemistry to you? Your stomach was settled and your heart felt open. You said, may that person experience the same kind of pain that they're causing me. And you were open-hearted posture like this. Your whole neurological wiring goes into that contraction and ill will. Your stomach, your heart, your brain, every part of you is participating. So the practice is to free you from what happens when you're stuck in resentment or ill will. Then you become a person less likely to pass on pain from having experienced pain. So the third of the Brahmaviharas then, which you might practice towards this person, this is where it gets really advanced, it's called mudita. It means appreciative joy. Mudita. Appreciative joy means happiness for the other person's happiness. So, let's say that the person who wronged you did so in such a way as their life looks extraordinary now. They got the house and the car. They got the business and you didn't. Or they got all the friends and you got none of them. Or they had an affair and they ran off with her and now they're having a honeymoon and they're getting married. Let's say that it turned out to be extraordinary for them and really terrible for you. And you tried loving kindness meditation, and that helped to lessen some of the pain. But now you're going to try mudita. You're going to try happiness for their happiness. So that when they come to mind, or some memory about them comes to mind, or some fantasy about what you see their life doing now, whether you know it intimately or not, you're able to say, I'm happy for your happiness. I'm appreciating the way that you come into joy right now. We can also practice this towards neutral people who just seem to have more contented or easygoing lives. And you say, well, that person doesn't seem to really struggle like I do. The near enemy of mudita is comparison. So when you start comparing, you may, if you always come up in the deficit, you may go to the far enemy of appreciative joy, which is envy. And living with envy is not a very pleasant neurological biochemical soup. So when you look at somebody whose life you might envy, you could say, wow, I'm really happy for how they experience happiness. I feel joy for their ability to experience joy. And it transforms your heart and your biochemistry to make that offering to them. You don't have to say it directly to somebody, but you're feeling that in their direction frees you from having to live with ongoing envy. Envy is a very contracted state and produces more misery, and the likelihood of gossip and pettiness. So it infiltrates your relationships with other people also. So by the time you get to comparison, you're on the little slippery slope towards envy, which is why we practice when we come into comparison. Say, how might I be happy for this person's happiness? I give an example frequently, and I'll just do it briefly here for now, because it's a really visceral example for me that we live on a dead end, and to get to our home, I like to bike commute, as you know, and it's downhill for the last part, downhill like minimally, but it was really uphill for the most treacherous part of the ride with a dog cart behind me. So my heart is pumping a lot, and I get to the top of the hill. Now I'm going to just cruise towards the driveway. I'm really relaxed, and I'm heading home, and my neighbor is once more washing his car. It's been raining, but he's washing his car, and he's got the chemical visitors for the garden, the big truck that comes to spray to get the weeds to go away. Oh, I wanted to have ease for the last 200 yards of my bike ride home, but now I'm flinching because he's using a water resource and he's putting chemicals on the garden. These are against my life values. In the early morning when I leave the house on the bicycle, I'm just getting my heart rate going, and I'm like stoked to be on the bike, and there he might be doing the same thing, washing the car. I'm not saying the next morning, I'm saying this happens on a regular enough basis that I see it coming and going, that Pete washes his car. He has more than one car, and they're very clean. And the water's running down the street, because it can't all go on the car, so he's got a hose, and it's just trickling down the way. Because he's got a bumper for his driveway so it doesn't get flooded, so the water's going to the next person's driveway. Poor Pete. He gets to be my practice for mudita. Because I know there's something about his nature that's a little bit compulsive. A little bit, maybe OCD. You have met? Yeah. And so this is how he's working out his sense of okayness in the world. And I do know some other things about his life, too. He's been at the bus stop at the same time as me a few times. And I can practice mudita for him. I'm not saying I like those life values. But I'm more okay in the world when I have a sense that he's going to be balanced on that day because he cleaned his car. He feels refreshed and centered, and he's going to go about his day making a contribution in the world rather than feeling compromised. So I say, there's Pete, my chance to practice. I don't go to my garden and say, and see here, how beautiful with no chemicals. I don't leave messages on Pete's car. It's clean enough. Like little anonymous notes around the yard. His direct neighbor has a sign on her garden that says, chemical-free, all-natural compost used here. They've been neighbors a long time. They were both living in the neighborhood when I moved to the neighborhood, and this is in the year 2000, so, some 15 years later, they're still doing this between each other. And, yeah. So happiness for somebody else's happiness. Even if it's not according to your life values, what we're glad for is the relief they might experience that prevents them from being a person who has to live now with cruelty or ill will or envy or misery. And mudita also then can lead you to the next of the Brahmaviharas, which is called upeksha. And upekshanam, which is how you say in the Yoga Sutras, means equanimity. Equanimity. And I like to define equanimity as your capacity to stay afloat in the difficult world, not to be so sunk by or collapsed by. You're not treading water, but you're not like on this immense ocean liner that doesn't feel the ocean moving. You know, it's like so steady and so slow. You don't feel life moving you. So it's your capacity to be resilient and floatable enough that you are navigating the waves of life. You're participating, but you're not falling into greed, anger, rage, which are the far enemies of equanimity. The near enemy of equanimity, people get a little confused by. The near enemy is indifference and detachment. But by this, when they say detachment here, they mean like aloof. They don't mean the skillful kind of non-attachment that they're talking about in earlier Yoga Sutras. It means you get sort of cold, indifferent, and aloof, but you feel that you're actually experiencing equanimity. Like you're not so touchable. That's more like living in a bubble that you're making, and it's not the same as equanimity. Partly because if your bubble gets cracked, it shatters pretty quickly. You might realize the greed, rage, or anger that's underneath there, or the vulnerability that you don't have yet a relationship to, so when you taste it, you might get very angry that it arose, or feel really overwhelmed and collapse. Jay likes to talk about the fortitude of the egg, the raw egg. Can you tell that story, please?
Well, it's actually, just now I was thinking that the other drawback to the bubble is that what you're putting out into the world is not the same either. It's not as rich, it's not as connected to the world, so it's not just the danger of it cracking that's the problem, is that you're not getting in the richness of the world, and you're not able to give out the richness that you have to offer the world either. So the egg one...
The raw egg that can't be crushed, but if you...
Yeah. Oh. Okay, so the detachment, if you think of it as a shell, like an egg shell, I don't know if you've ever done this, but there's a little trick. You can get an egg, and if you hold it endwise in your hands and try to crush it, you can't do it because of the physics of the egg, the molecules, the way they line up in the shell. If you get it straight on, you can't crush the egg. But it's still incredibly fragile. It's impermeable, it's waterproof, it's airproof, all that. It's an amazing little system, but it's also incredibly fragile and rigid. So people who live inside those eggshells may be very well protected, but even just a little scratch, you can imagine, just a little scratchy sound on the outside of it to the occupant might arouse danger signals, because it's just a tiny ding, and the whole thing falls, and the integrity of the entire system falls apart. In psychoanalysis, they would refer to that as, I like to quote this one, tantamount to annihilation. So it's a desperate defensive position, using Western language here, that you're in all the time. Because any moment it can go from 0 to 100 in terms of the fight or flight syndrome. And that guarded condition is self-oriented, it's conserving, it's stingy, it's fearful, quick to anger, it's impatient, irritable. It's all the things that we're talking about here. A lot of people are living in some version of that without recognizing it. But the symptoms are present. I mean, look around you, the symptoms are there. All from individual cases all the way up to international relationships. It's the same stuff, exactly the same dynamics. And the consequences are inevitably the same as well. As long as you cling to that, you're stuck with the consequences of that. As soon as you
Yeah.
just choose to drop it, as soon as you observe it and then you make a choice, you're not only moving towards the sort of the favorable end, but you're no longer contributing to the negative end. So it's sort of a double benefit there. A lot of people will attend to one, I want the good part, or I want to get rid of the bad part. But if you do one or the other, from a bigger perspective, you're actually covering all the bases. Yes, just as an individual, of course, but that's quite a contribution, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's an important thing, is that as you're practicing the Brahmaviharas, if you have a sense, let's say that this narrative comes up for you frequently, like, well, who am I to practice this? Other people are still suffering. Is it really okay to increase my equanimity, my loving kindness, my compassion, my joy and buoyancy in life when so many people have so little? Or there's so much poverty on the planet. I should go out and be of service. This is a service. For you to be a person who's not contributing to the fray, to be a person who's less likely to be aversive or greedy, that is a contribution already. And quite likely the Brahmaviharas increase your capacity for your common humanity, and when you are of service, you do it without the same quality of grasping that some people go to orphanages with, like more of a missionary attitude, not a just heart-to-heart attitude. When you are of service, it may be something simple, like you let somebody into traffic, or a person. This just happened at this conference. We arrived early, we got seats, it's very crowded, and I was out in the lobby where they were still doing registration, and somebody came in. She was clearly flustered, and she made several attempts to find a seat, and somebody was already sitting there, so she couldn't sit down, and this and that. And she said to somebody, well, I have to find some place to sit. And then she stormed out of the room, and I was standing in the doorway while I was watching this interaction, so she stormed past me, and she went to the bathroom, and I didn't know how long a line was in the bathroom, so I was then in the bathroom, and you could hear her complaining to somebody else about how rude the other citizens were in the room where there were no seats, and she was clearly distressed, and you could feel people's aversion to her. So I just made a deliberate practice from my own deep breathing that would say, yeah, I welcome your distress, I get it. I've also been there. And it's really uncomfortable to be that person who's expressing distress when other people kind of back away from you, like, what's your trouble? We're all therapists here. We're here to study with Bessel van der Kolk. Get it together. Instead of saying, wow, brains do experience trauma. This is what it feels like when the brain is rushing and it's late and it doesn't feel included, and maybe she got shunned earlier that morning by somebody else, and pan back and look and try to take in the heart-to-heart experience instead. That's a contribution. It lessens the likelihood of that person then rippling out into more distress. So in that regard, these are actually active practices, like the active choice you make to practice equanimity rather than greed, rage, or anger. I do see them as having like a linear progression. On the one hand, if you want to practice them as developmental practices, you go compassion, loving kindness, appreciative joy, equanimity, perhaps starting with patience again. But I also see these as remedies. So if somebody comes to see me and they're really experiencing something for which loving kindness would be a good remedy, we start there. And sometimes people are trying to practice compassion when actually what they would benefit from more would be appreciative joy. Or they're trying to practice loving kindness, but they're not ready for that. The equanimity may be an easier starting place to get them in the doorway. So you do attune it to who you're working with and what the challenges are. Yes?
Are there enemies to mudita?
Yes. Comparison is the first, and then it goes to envy and jealousy.
And what is the far enemy of equanimity?
Greed, rage, and anger. Think about when people want to save the planet, or they're ecological activists, or they want to save a certain marginalized population from being more oppressed, and they're really impassioned about it, but they also get to the point of burnout and anger and political conflict and strife, and no two sides are hearing the other two sides fairly, and the shared human condition has gone out the window. Both sides are angry and righteous. That's the far enemy of equanimity. You really want to make change, that's the greed part. And you're really angry about the other side doing what they're doing. That's the rage part. It's really hard to make a difference from that platform.
I just feel so lucky to be in a community of people who are learning to, observe others in their state and just have compassion. And I don't know, I feel like I was born with that. And so when you're surrounded by people that are teaching you about it, you don't even know that exists, and you're like, oh. And then it feels so much better to be loving and kind towards someone who's having such a hard time, including people on the corner.
Yeah.
Because really, but for the grace of God, go any of us, really. You never know.
It's true. We're born with really porous, sponge-like, fragile brains waiting for the input from whoever's around us. And some of us got really difficult input. Some of us got neglectful input, so certain kinds of input didn't happen that could have made circumstances better. Some of us got more loving and attuned input. And those circumstances, we lived through them enough to get here, like I said last night, and now we can become curious about how that happened, how it formed us, how we've been, let's say, committed to or justifying our formation, but how we're also ready for transformation. And part of our readiness is that we practice in community and we see other people taking those risks and living the teachings of yoga. We see their life seems to be improving. They less often have the hindrances or the symptoms of the obstacles. So in that case, when you admire somebody, it's not like the near enemy or the far enemy of mudita. Your admiration for what you see them growing towards can magnetically pull you in that direction also. It doesn't need to have the residue of comparison or envy, or even start dissecting how they got to have their blessed position and you didn't get to have those blessings in your position. I often hear people in some of the circles that I've been teaching, they'll say how other people, they were more fortunate, they got it better than we got it, or they had more advantage, so we aren't going to be able to do it. And I want to transform that thinking to help prevent the near enemy and the far enemy. Any other contributions or questions right now? This is a more hopeful topic than last night's. Like the middle of last night was like a little bit morose. Like, here's your symptoms, here's what happened. This is probably what you're navigating. And by the way, one craving begets another laziness, and laziness can turn into carelessness, and then overindulgence, and your practice starts to regress, and then you feel hopeless, and then you start getting sick all the time, and you're vacillating between do I stay or do I go, as they say in that song. But that is an important perspective to know. But the remedies are a part of this passage in the Yoga Sutras also. So I like the Brahmaviharas as a sutra because it's so much more hopeful and you can actively engage. So if you're a person who can't sit and concentrate on one sensory object, you may have enough interpersonal conflict because your brain might be a little out of balance there, that you get to actively practice the Brahmaviharas. So you say, oh, good for me. My brain is so easily dysregulated by others that now I have 4 new practices to do. I'm so lucky. Not like,
I have something to add.
Go ahead, and then we'll come over to you.
So I do yoga therapy in several different venues, including a treatment center, my son's grade school, and I guess I'm sort of realized that just practicing these things is so big. Because I've seen especially in the treatment center, I can't say especially, and just in many avenues, counselors, teachers, people that I thought knew better, looking at Jay, have all this training and I'm thinking, I'm just a yoga therapist, whatever, And so I had this expectation that these people with these big degrees and whatever are going to have, what I think I'm offering, and they don't. And I'm watching directors of treatment centers treat clients like they're, it's like, wait a second, you were, just sober at one point too. You acted this way too. And I'm just realizing that offering your presence and connection and compassion and just all of these things is something you can choose to do every moment.
It's really big.
And it's huge. And it's so not seen in so many different places where people, is it people in the margins, I guess is
Yeah.
how you would say
That's
it.
my phrase.
They,
Yeah.
you know, like veterans and with PTSD, and it's, I don't know, just offering your presence is so big with this.
It's significant.
Just a yoga therapist, sometimes bigger
Yeah.
than what I've seen.
And if you
masters,
saw the brain
doctors.
imaging of the person to whom you're offering that, when you're being genuine, the brain imaging would light up the parts of their brain that have receptors for empathy and connection. And that's really important that we're able to develop that. If you see the brain imaging of someone who's feeling condescended towards, you see different parts of their brain lighting up. You think, we should be anxious about that for what it causes biochemically and neurologically, and what brain parts shut down and which ones get more vigilant. Just to know that you actually are affecting the brain at that level as well. People feel it viscerally in their heart. And we watch sometimes in these trainings that we go to what's called a still face experiment. It's where a child is playing with the mother and she's engaging and their two faces are enjoying each other, and then they ask the mother to go really still for a certain period of time. And you start watching the child dysregulate and, please for the mother, concern for the mother, holding the mother, crying about the mother, looking towards what might be the camera person, the researcher, or you see this and you start getting goosebumps, you tear up, you're swallowing, your heart's contracting. Oh my God, it's so painful to see that. And the fact that we feel that pain when we're watching the still face experiment says your empathy circuits are on board. And the mother lights back up and you have relief because the baby's like, oh, there's the baby and the mother again connected. And they followed this experiment where when they would bring the child back a few months later, they measured their biochemistry. And when the child walked in to the same room in which the research experiment had been done, they registered that the child got stressed. It didn't look stressed on the outside because children are, resilient and moving about, but the child's brain registered, this is where that distressing thing happened. And so we think these little moments of misattunement aren't such a significant thing, but they can be if it's chronic misattunement and that child's brain doesn't get to light up with connection. Now, if there's a miss, as I like to say, the language in the culture is if there's a rupture in a relationship, you have the chance to create a repair. And that's also really valuable. So if you've been a distracted mom for more than a minute, don't worry yourself to sleep tonight over the misattunements. The question isn't, were there ruptures? The question is, what was the repair like? Did we come back around and help wake up this child's brain to really feel confident and trustworthy that we're there?
So you might just be that in somebody's life.
Yeah.
We all have those. In fact, the theory goes all the way back to a guy named Winnicott, that it's not that there's a misses or ruptures that it's a problem. It's if the baby experiences the misses and the ruptures and there's a correction of it, then they're also learning, well, shit happens and it's okay because it can come back around. And they're developing the capacity to self-soothe in the interim, perhaps, or to engage in different ways that might help them to figure out, to activate something that brings it back to them. It's very important that we have those imperfections. Well, it's inevitable, we couldn't do anything about it, but it's important that we accept that will happen and know what to do to correct it. And the cool thing is we already know what to do. We don't have to read a book about it. We get all that other stuff out of our way. The reaction is the same. There were 200 people or so yesterday watching this thing, and it was 2 minutes, and I was like, it
was really hard.
Shit.
It was a 2-minute video. The still face was going on about 30 seconds, but you get it right away. Like,
No. She was actually, it was 2 minutes where she had a still face.
how long was the whole video for
Excruciating
us?
2 minutes. It was probably about 5 or so minutes.
Oh, I guess I lost track of time.
Yeah,
It was very painful.
It was
the
just,
whole thing.
It was almost disorienting, and then she finally came back, and I wanted to just, and she just went about like nothing had ever happened. Like, oh, that's not enough. And the whole room was just, ugh.
Yeah. Like, people stopped breathing while they were watching the video, and some like,
tears were coming out.
some people are like, I gotta go get a drink. You see people leave their seats. It's like, oh, so painful.
And this is just watching another transaction too. This is removed, pretty far removed actually, on a screen up at the front of the room.
Yeah. Let's come to here before we do the loving kindness meditation.
So you had mentioned to appreciate the joy of somebody else, maybe that has a wrong view. And two people came to mind of people that made things more difficult for me, and I was trying to appreciate the joy that they may have had from that circumstance, but I don't feel like they came away with joy. I feel like they're still angry and bitter and in their own sadness and everything on their end. And I'm struggling to see the benefit that they had from disrupting my life. So I'm not really sure, I feel like I can practice loving kindness towards them.
Yes.
But I wouldn't know where to start with appreciating what joy they might have.
If they're not experiencing joy or well-being or fun or happiness out of whatever pain they've caused, you don't have, mudita wouldn't really fit in that case. Appreciative joy wouldn't be well spent on them. So it sounds like loving kindness, and even loving kindness, but also compassion for the pain they might still be causing other people. So compassion is generally, when we read it in the sutras, can you practice compassion towards people who are harming others? And loving kindness towards someone who's harmed you. So if they've caused harm to you, loving kindness can be great. And if you have a sense that they're still causing harm to others, maybe compassion for the way in which their brain and heart and body and mind are operating when they're so distressed and they don't realize that they're doing it. Even compassion for what we would call in yoga avidya, for their ignorance. And I don't mean ignorance like a judgment word, I mean it like they forgot their basic birthright as a human and the other humans' birthrights as well. So they might be acting in ways that cause more cruelty or harm or conflict. And so we can have compassion for how humans behave when that's their circumstances, and specifically loving kindness for how they behave towards you. Does that help to some extent?
Yeah.
Now that's why these are active practices, and you want to get the right one. It's like getting the right essential oil for what's happening for you. So it's very much like medicine. Yeah. Okay, let's take a comfortable and upright seat, please. I want to give you a few minutes of the loving kindness practice because it's one of the more well-known ones, and I have a short translation that I like to use as a repetitive phrase, and I invite you to internalize it and see if it's useful to you. So you can come to your particular comfortable and upright seat. You might choose to close your eyes again or to have them quietly cast down. And take a few breath cycles where you can transition your mind from listening to conversation to a more inward place to practice. And as I say these phrases, I'll be asking you to repeat the phrases to yourself. So if I say, "May I be free from unnecessary pain and suffering," you're going to repeat the pronoun I to yourself. When we say, "May you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering," you'll be repeating that on behalf of somebody else. I might say he or she at times. So first I'll ask you to bring yourself into your own heart and to actually visualize that you're holding yourself. And from your own heart towards yourself you may say, "May I be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May I be free from unnecessary pain and suffering." May I know peace and joy. You can and repeat to yourself, may I know peace and joy. Soften your eyes and your heart as you hear yourself say to yourself, may I know love and harmony. May I know love and harmony. May I be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May I know peace and joy. May I know love and harmony. And now bring to your heart someone who's been a benevolent or kind influence in your life, someone from whom you've received blessings or support or resources. We'll call this person a benefactor. And as you say from your own heart towards their heart, we'll use the pronoun you, referring to this person who's been a kind support in your life. You may say to them, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you know peace and joy. May you know peace and joy. And from your heart towards their heart, you may say, may you know love and harmony. May you know love and harmony. May this person who has been a benefactor to you, may he or she be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May they know peace and joy. May they know love and harmony. And now bring to mind a neutral person, a person that you know in your day-to-day life, but you don't have a particularly intimate relationship with. They might be the grocery clerk, the postman. And bring them into your heart so you can have a sense that you'd actually be able to say this internally in their presence. May you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you know peace and joy. May you know peace and joy. May this relatively neutral person, to whom you might say silently to yourself when you next see them, you might say, may you know love and harmony. May you know love and harmony. Notice how your heart responds to those invitations and offerings. And then bring to your heart someone from whom you have experienced a more minor pain. You don't have to go to a really big person right now. And towards this person who may have caused a little dent or some difficulty, hold them in your heart as you say, "May you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering." May you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you know peace and joy. May you know peace and joy. And towards this person who may have dented your life in a certain way or caused you some pain, you may say, "May you know love and harmony." May you know love and harmony. And coming back to your own heart, you may repeat to yourself, "May I and all beings be free from unnecessary pain and suffering." May I and all beings be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May I know peace and joy. May I know peace and joy. May I and all beings everywhere know peace and joy. May I know love and harmony. You may repeat to yourself, "May I know love and harmony." May I and all beings everywhere know love and harmony. With appreciation for your efforts to practice, please bring your hands together in Anjali Mudra. And just notice any difference in your heart, in your mind. You may bow your head to your heart, offering that gesture of loving kindness to any other vulnerable part in yourself. May that part know the freedom from unnecessary pain and suffering. May that part know peace and joy. And may that part of yourself also experience love and harmony. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.